In the winter of 1867, along the windswept plains of southeastern Dakota Territory, a Norwegian immigrant named Lars Eriksen made a decision that would mark him as either a fool or a genius. His neighbors, hardened American homesteaders and fellow Scandinavian settlers who had survived at least one brutal winter on the frontier, watched with a mixture of amusement and pity as Lars began constructing what they considered a laughably inadequate heating solution for his newly completed cabin. The previous winter had been merciless. Temperatures had plummeted to 30 below zero, and the wind had screamed across the open prairie with such ferocity that snow found its way through the tiniest gaps in cabin walls. Families had burned through their entire winter wood supply by February, forcing men to venture out in deadly cold to cut frozen timber with numb fingers and desperate determination. 3 homesteads within 10 miles had been abandoned, their occupants retreating eastward with tales of the unforgiving land where even the strongest iron stoves seemed powerless against the cold. Lars had arrived in late spring of 1867 with his wife Ingrid and their 2 young children, having spent his first summer raising a modest cabin of hewn oak logs. His neighbors, particularly the established families who had weathered multiple winters, offered him stern advice as autumn approached. Build the biggest cast iron stove you can afford or haul, they insisted. Stockpile at least 15 cords of split oak. Chink every crack with oakum and mud. Accept that you'll wake to frost on the inside walls and spend half your waking hours feeding the fire. But Lars had other plans rooted in old knowledge from the mountain valleys of Norway, where stone and clay had heated homes for centuries before iron foundries made metal stoves commonplace. While his neighbors hauled massive cast iron box stoves into their cabins, stoves that weighed 300 pounds and demanded constant feeding, Lars began working with clay from the creek bank, river stones, and fire bricks he'd carefully transported in his wagon from Sioux Falls, 60 miles distant. That little thing, his neighbor Thomas McCarthy said one October afternoon, watching Lars carefully construct what appeared to be an absurdly small heating device in the corner of his cabin. The structure was barely 3 feet tall and perhaps 18 inches square at its base, elegant in its simplicity, but comically undersized compared to the hulking iron monsters that dominated neighboring hearths. Lars, my friend, that might keep your hands warm while you're sitting right next to it, but you'll freeze 10 feet away. This isn't Norway. Dakota winter will kill you dead if you don't respect it. Other neighbors echoed the sentiment. Johan Lindström, a Swedish farmer whose own cabin boasted a massive iron stove that consumed a quarter cord of wood every day, shook his head in dismay. I've seen men underestimate this land, he said quietly. Your children, Lars. Think of your children. Even those who wished Lars well, who admired his carpentry skills and steady work ethic, privately worried that stubbornness or ignorance would cost this family dearly. Ingrid herself had doubts, though she kept them largely to herself. She had trusted her husband's judgment across an ocean and through a grueling wagon journey. But watching him work with mud and stone while other families prepared with proven iron technology made her hands tremble as she kneaded bread. What if Thomas and Johan were right? What if her husband's old country ways were simply inadequate for this new, harsher world? Lars, for his part, worked with quiet confidence, though he shared few details of his design with curious neighbors. He spoke of thermal mass and heat retention in his Norwegian accented English, but these concepts seemed like wishful thinking compared to the immediate, visible power of a roaring iron stove. The clay structure he built looked more like a sculptural curiosity than a serious survival tool, with its smooth curved surfaces, its small front-loading door, and its impossibly narrow chimney flue. As the first serious cold spell arrived in early November, bringing temperatures down to 15 degrees Fahrenheit and coating the prairie grass with silver frost, the skepticism crystallized into certainty. Smoke rose thick and constant from every cabin chimney across the scattered settlement, the result of settlers feeding their iron stoves every 2 to 3 hours around the clock. From Lars Eriksen's cabin, by contrast, only the thinnest wisp of smoke emerged from his narrow chimney, so slight that some neighbors wondered if his family was even burning wood at all, perhaps instead huddling under blankets and foolishly hoping for an early spring. Thomas McCarthy's wife Mary mentioned her concerns to Ingrid at the settlement's informal Sunday gathering. Mary, Ingrid said with a smile that didn't quite mask her own anxiety, Lars says we will be warm. He says this stove will heat our home all day and all night on wood that I could carry myself. Mary nodded politely, the way one nods at a child's impossible dream, and made a mental note to prepare extra quilts to offer the Eriksen family when their inadequate heating failed. But first, everyone laughed. The laughter was not entirely cruel, though it carried the sharp edge of frontier pragmatism where survival depended on proven methods and dangerous experimentation could mean death. When Lars mentioned that his little clay stove would burn for 12 hours on a single log, the laughter echoed across harvest gatherings and Sunday meetings. 12 hours on one log. Impossible. The iron stoves demanded constant feeding, consuming split wood at a ravenous pace, and everyone knew this was simply the price of survival. Lars Eriksen's tiny clay contraption seemed like a recipe for disaster, a tragic miscalculation that would soon be corrected by harsh reality. What none of them understood yet was that Lars had not built a stove at all. He had built something far more sophisticated, a heating device that worked on principles as old as human civilization, but largely forgotten in the rush toward industrial iron production. The science behind it was impeccable, the construction was masterful, and the results would prove more effective than anything his neighbors had ever witnessed. But that revelation was still weeks away, and winter was coming fast. The structure Lars had built was called a Masonry Heater, though he knew it by its Norwegian name, Kakkelovn. To his neighbors, it simply looked like an oddly shaped clay tower with a small firebox opening at the base and a winding, maze-like interior that made no sense whatsoever. Why, they wondered, would you deliberately create such a long, convoluted path for smoke and heat to travel? Conventional wisdom dictated that heat should go straight up the chimney as efficiently as possible to create strong draft. What Lars had constructed over the course of 6 weeks was a thermal labyrinth. The firebox itself was small, lined with fire bricks that could withstand intense heat. But instead of connecting directly to a chimney, the hot gases from the fire were forced to travel through a series of internal channels within the clay and stone mass. The smoke wound upward, then horizontally, then upward again, following a serpentine path designed to extract every possible calorie of heat before finally exiting through the narrow flue. The outer structure consisted of clay mixed with sand and straw for binding strength, reinforced with river stones for thermal mass. The entire assembly weighed nearly 800 pounds, far more than even the largest iron stoves his neighbors possessed. But weight, Lars knew, was not a disadvantage. It was the entire point. Johan Lindström visited on a cold afternoon in mid-November, ostensibly to borrow a draw knife, but really to examine this peculiar heating experiment more closely. The temperature outside hovered around 25 degrees, and a stiff north wind made it feel far colder. Johan expected to find the Eriksen family bundled in coats and blankets. Instead, he found the cabin comfortably warm, the children playing on the floor in simple woolen shirts, Ingrid working at her table without shawl or mittens. "You have a fire going?" Johan asked, confused. He could barely detect any smoke from outside, and the tiny door of the clay stove showed no visible flames, just a deep red glow from within. "We had a fire this morning," Lars replied with a slight smile. "One fire, at 7 o'clock. Good hot fire for about 2 hours. Now the stove does its work." Johan placed his hand against the smooth clay surface of the structure. It was warm, almost uncomfortably so, radiating steady heat like a living thing. He walked to the far corner of the cabin, a full 15 feet from the stove. Even there, the temperature was pleasant, nothing like the frigid zones that existed more than 6 feet from his own iron stove. "I don't understand," Johan admitted. "Where is the fire? How can it still be warm?" "The stone and clay hold the heat," Lars explained. "The fire burns very hot, very fast. All the heat goes into the mass. Then the mass releases it slowly, evenly, for many hours. Tonight before bed, I will burn another log. 1 log, maybe 2. That will heat us through the night and into tomorrow morning." Johan shook his head in wonder. His own family burned wood constantly, his eldest son waking twice each night to feed the iron stove lest they wake to a frozen cabin. "How hot does the fire burn?" he asked. "Very hot. Perhaps 1200 degrees, even hotter. The fire bricks protect the outer clay. The smoke that comes out the chimney is almost cool, because all the heat stays inside the stove." What neighbors didn't realize was that Lars had essentially built a thermal battery, a massive heat storage device that charged quickly with intense fire and discharged slowly over many hours. The principle was simple in concept, but required precise construction. The internal channels had to be sized correctly to allow smoke to flow while maximizing surface contact with the thermal mass. The clay and stone had to be thick enough to store substantial heat, but not so thick that it took too long to warm up. The fire bricks in the firebox had to withstand extreme temperatures while insulating the outer structure. But there was a problem he hadn't anticipated, a challenge that emerged only after several weeks of use. The intense heat of the burns, necessary to properly charge the thermal mass, created tremendous stress on the materials. Lars had noticed small cracks beginning to form in the clay surface, particularly where the internal channels made sharp turns. These cracks didn't yet affect performance, but they worried him. Would the structure survive the entire winter? Would he need to rebuild portions of it? And if so, how would he do that in the depths of January cold? He shared these concerns with no one, not even Ingrid, not wanting to vindicate the doubters who predicted failure. Instead, he carefully monitored the cracks, mixed fresh clay to seal them, and adjusted his burning technique to reduce thermal shock. The real secret would only become clear later, when he discovered that the cracks were actually expanding and contracting with the heating and cooling cycles, a natural flexing that the clay could accommodate as long as the foundational structure remained sound. Thomas McCarthy visited next, bringing his wife Mary and their 2 teenage sons. They came ostensibly for a social call, but everyone understood the real purpose: to see if the Eriksen family was truly staying warm or putting on a brave face while suffering in private. The temperature outside had dropped to 18 degrees, and a December storm was brewing, bringing the promise of heavy snow. What they found astonished them. The Eriksen cabin was not merely warm, but genuinely comfortable, warmer in fact than their own home despite the significantly smaller heating device. Little did they know that Lars had burned only 2 oak logs that morning, logs he'd split to about 6 inches in diameter and 16 inches long. The fire had lasted approximately 90 minutes, burning intensely with plenty of air, and had then been allowed to burn down completely to coals and ash. Now, 5 hours later, the clay stove radiated gentle, even warmth that pervaded every corner of the one-room cabin. "I burn a quarter cord every 3 days," Thomas said, doing calculations in his head. "If what you're saying is true, Lars, you're burning maybe a tenth of that. Less. Perhaps a 20th, Lars replied quietly. "I burn twice per day when it's very cold. 1 log each time, sometimes 2. The stove gives back the heat slowly, evenly. No cold spots, no frozen walls. And I can sleep through the night without waking to feed the fire." Mary McCarthy walked to the stove and held her hands near its surface, not touching but close enough to feel the radiant warmth. "It's like standing in sunshine," she said with wonder. "Our iron stove, you can barely stand to touch it right after we load it, burning your hand if you're careless, but then it cools so fast. This is different. Steady." The science behind this was surprisingly simple, though it contradicted everything the settlers had been taught about heating. Iron stoves worked on the principle of immediate convection. Fire heated iron, iron heated air, hot air rose and circulated. This created rapid warmth, but also rapid heat loss. The iron itself had almost no thermal mass, heating quickly and cooling quickly. The fire had to be maintained constantly because once it died, the heat disappeared within minutes. Lars's masonry heater worked on a completely different principle: thermal mass and radiant heat. The fire's energy was absorbed into hundreds of pounds of clay and stone, which then released that energy slowly through radiation over 10 to 12 hours. The surface temperature of the stove never became dangerously hot, remaining comfortable to touch even during active burning, but the steady radiation warmed objects and people directly rather than just heating air. This radiant heat felt more comfortable at lower temperatures and didn't create the same drafts and hot-cold zones that plagued convection heating. But what neighbors also didn't understand was the efficiency equation. Their iron stoves sent most of the heat straight up the chimney, sometimes with flue gases exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit. This created good draft, but represented enormous energy waste. Lars's serpentine channels cooled the exhaust gases to perhaps 200 degrees or less, extracting nearly all the usable heat before allowing smoke to escape. The intense burns also meant complete combustion, virtually no creosote buildup, and minimal smoke production. Word began to spread through the scattered settlement. By late December, as temperatures plunged toward zero and below, families who had initially scoffed at Lars's tiny clay stove began making excuses to visit, to see for themselves if the rumors were true. Each visitor left shaking their head in amazement, and several began asking detailed questions about construction. "How did you know to build it this way?" Thomas finally asked one evening, his professional skepticism giving way to genuine curiosity. "My grandfather was a mason in the Gudbrandsdal Valley," Lars explained. "Every home had stone heaters like this, some very large, some small. They are common in Norway, Sweden, Finland, Russia. Very old design. Hundreds of years, maybe thousands. When I came to America and saw only iron stoves, I thought perhaps the old ways were not needed here. But then I saw how much wood these stoves eat, how uneven the heat, how much work to keep them burning. I remembered my grandfather's house, warm all day from 2 fires. I thought, perhaps the old way is better way." The real secret came later, though, when January arrived with the brutal cold that Dakota Territory was famous for. That was when the true test would begin, when the limits of every heating system would be revealed, when Lars Eriksen's gamble would be vindicated or proven fatal. Meanwhile, as the solstice passed and the darkest days settled over the prairie, families watched their wood piles shrink with growing anxiety, and more than a few sets of eyes turned toward the Eriksen cabin with its impossibly thin wisp of smoke and its warm, steady glow visible through the oiled paper windows. To understand why Lars Eriksen's masonry heater performed so dramatically better than conventional iron stoves, one must understand the 3 fundamental mechanisms of heat transfer: conduction, convection, and radiation. Every heating system relies on all 3, but the proportions matter enormously, and this is where traditional frontier wisdom had led settlers astray. The cast iron stoves that dominated American homesteads in the 1860s were marvels of industrial manufacturing, shipped by rail to frontier towns and hauled by wagon to remote claims. They worked primarily through convection and conduction. The fire heated the iron box through conduction. The iron heated the surrounding air through conduction and convection, and the hot air rose and circulated through the cabin. This produced rapid, intense heat in the immediate vicinity of the stove, but created pronounced temperature gradients. It was not uncommon for the area within 5 feet of an iron stove to be uncomfortably hot, reaching 80 or 90 degrees, while the far corners of the same room hovered barely above freezing. More problematically, iron has a very low thermal mass relative to its surface area. A 300-pound iron stove could absorb only a modest amount of heat energy before reaching equilibrium, and once the fire died down, that stored energy dissipated within an hour or 2. The mathematical reality was unforgiving. Iron has a specific heat capacity of about 0.11 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. Stone and clay, by contrast, have specific heat capacities of 0.20 to 0.24, nearly double. But the real advantage came from mass. Lars's 800-pound masonry heater could store roughly 6 times more heat energy than a typical iron stove. The serpentine channel design was equally crucial. Historical records from Scandinavian builders, documented in journals that made their way to America with immigrants, showed that these heating systems had been refined over centuries. The principle was elegant. Hot gases from combustion contain enormous energy, but if they exit immediately through a straight chimney, that energy is lost to the atmosphere. By forcing the gases through a long, winding path surrounded by thermal mass, the heat is transferred from the gas to the solid material through conduction and radiation. Lars's design incorporated approximately 12 feet of internal channel length despite the compact external dimensions of the heater. The gases would enter the firebox at combustion temperature, sometimes exceeding 1200 degrees Fahrenheit during the intense burns Lars employed. By the first turn, that temperature would drop to perhaps 800 degrees. By the second horizontal section, perhaps 500. By the time the exhaust reached the final vertical channel leading to the chimney, the temperature measured only 180 to 200 degrees, barely above the condensation point for water vapor. This extraction efficiency meant that nearly all the chemical energy in the wood was captured as useful heat rather than sent skyward. A cord of oak contains approximately 24 million BTU of energy. In a conventional iron stove with poor efficiency, Perhaps 40 to 50% of that energy actually heated the home, with the rest lost up the chimney. In Lars's masonry heater, efficiency approached 80 to 85%. The wood didn't burn longer. It burned hotter and more completely, and the heat was captured rather than wasted. The combustion process itself was different in critical ways. Iron stoves of the era typically burned wood at moderate temperatures in an oxygen-limited environment, especially at night when dampers were closed to extend burn times. This created incomplete combustion, producing smoke, creosote, and carbon monoxide while wasting energy. Lars's approach was opposite: short, intense burns with plenty of oxygen. The firebox temperature soared, achieving what modern engineers call secondary combustion, where even the volatile gases released from the wood ignited and burned completely. This hot, fast burning had additional benefits documented in European texts that Lars's grandfather had taught him to understand. Complete combustion meant minimal creosote deposits, reducing chimney fire risk to nearly zero. The high temperatures also burned away organic acids that would otherwise corrode iron stoves over time. And the short burn cycles meant the family didn't breathe combustion byproducts continuously as they did with constantly smoldering iron stoves. But the most dramatic difference came from radiation versus convection as the primary heat delivery mechanism. Iron stoves heated air, and air is a poor thermal medium with very low density and specific heat. Hot air rises rapidly, stratifying the room and creating drafts as cold air is pulled along the floor toward the stove to replace rising hot air. This air movement feels cold and uncomfortable, even in a theoretically warm room. Radiant heat, by contrast, travels in straight lines at the speed of light, warming objects and bodies directly without requiring air as a medium. When you stand near Lars's masonry heater, photons of infrared radiation travel from the warm clay surface to your skin, where they are absorbed and converted to heat at the molecular level. This is the same mechanism by which the sun warms your face on a cold day, and it feels more comfortable than convected heat at the same temperature. The steady surface temperature of the masonry heater, typically maintained between 140 and 170 degrees Fahrenheit during the slow discharge cycle, was optimal for radiant heat transfer. This temperature was high enough to provide substantial warming, but low enough to avoid the dangerous hot spots and burn risks of iron stove surfaces, which could exceed 500 degrees when freshly loaded. Historical records show that similar heating systems were common throughout Northern Europe, adapted to local materials and needs. In Finland, the massive contraflow heaters could weigh several tons and heat entire homes for 24 hours from a single firing. In Russia, the traditional Russian fireplace, or Russian stove, combined heating with cooking surfaces and even sleeping platforms built atop the warm mass. German settlers brought knowledge of Grundofen heaters, while Swiss immigrants understood Speicheröfen principles. Each culture had developed the same essential technology independently, recognizing that thermal mass was the key to efficient heating in cold climates. French-Canadian trappers who occasionally passed through southeastern Dakota Territory had their own version, often built into the corner of log structures using fieldstone and mud mortar, though their designs were typically cruder than the sophisticated channel systems Lars had constructed. These trappers reported similar performance: 1 or 2 fires per day, minimal wood consumption, steady comfortable warmth even in the depths of northern winter. The mathematics of heat storage became clear when examining specific examples. If Lars burned 2 oak logs twice daily, each log containing roughly 12 pounds of dry wood, he was consuming about 48 pounds of wood per day. At approximately 7,500 BTU per pound for oak, this represented 360,000 BTU daily. With 80% efficiency, approximately 288,000 BTU actually heated the cabin. Spread over 24 hours, this provided 12,000 BTU per hour. Thomas McCarthy's iron stove, by contrast, consumed approximately 125 pounds of wood daily, or 938,000 BTU of potential energy. At perhaps 50% efficiency, this delivered 469,000 BTU to the cabin, or 19,500 per hour. On the surface, this appeared to be more heat. But the reality was different because of the delivery method and the cabin's heat loss rate. A frontier cabin with reasonably tight construction and banked earth might lose heat at roughly 15,000 BTU per hour when the temperature difference between inside and outside was 40 degrees. During the depths of winter, when outside temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and families hoped to maintain 55 degrees inside, the difference was 75 degrees, and heat loss increased proportionally to perhaps 28,000 BTU per hour. The iron stove, delivering heat in pulses with high peaks and low valleys as fires were stoked and died down, struggled to maintain consistent warmth. The masonry heater, delivering steady radiant heat that warmed the occupants and even the cabin structure itself, creating secondary thermal mass in the log walls and furnishings, achieved comfort at lower average air temperatures while using far less fuel. There was also the critical factor of moisture. Iron stoves with hot surfaces could create relative humidity below 10% through rapid air heating and circulation, drying out respiratory passages and making the cold feel more penetrating. The gentler heat from masonry heaters maintained more reasonable humidity levels, improving comfort and health. Frontier journals from the period occasionally mention stove sickness, the headaches and respiratory irritation that plagued families during long winters, likely caused by the combination of incomplete combustion, extremely dry air, and rapid temperature fluctuations. Lars had explained none of this in technical terms to his neighbors, partly because his English wasn't refined enough for such explanations, and partly because he understood these principles through practical demonstration from his grandfather rather than theoretical study. But the results spoke clearly. By January of 1868, as the true test of winter began, the science would prove itself in the most dramatic possible fashion, and the settlers of southeastern Dakota Territory would witness a heating technology that worked not through brute force and constant labor, but through patient accumulation and steady release of energy captured from fire and stored in earth. The third week of January 1868 brought the kind of cold that made men question their decision to settle the northern plains. The temperature dropped to 18 below zero on Sunday evening, then continued falling through the night. By Monday morning, when Lars ventured outside to check his thermometer, the mercury had contracted to 31 below zero, and the wind was building from the northwest, carrying with it the promise of even worse conditions. The sky was a cruel, crystalline blue, achingly bright, and utterly cloudless. These were the most dangerous conditions, the clear high-pressure systems that allowed heat to radiate away into space with nothing to hold it close to Earth. Breath froze instantly into glittering ice crystals. Exposed skin would develop frostbite in less than 5 minutes. Even the smoke from cabin chimneys seemed to freeze, falling in white columns rather than rising. Across the scattered settlement, families waged desperate war against the cold. Thomas McCarthy woke every 2 hours through the night, stumbling half-frozen to his woodpile, loading his iron stove with split oak, adjusting dampers, and watching the thermometer inside the cabin with growing concern. Despite his best efforts, the interior temperature had dropped to 43 degrees by dawn, and frost coated the interior walls near the floor and ceiling corners. His family huddled together for warmth, wearing multiple layers of wool even inside the cabin, breathing clouds of vapor with each exhalation. Johan Lindstrom fared little better. His larger iron stove, a premium model he'd hauled from St. Paul at considerable expense, roared with constant fire. He estimated he was burning through wood at a rate that would exhaust his supply by mid-February, forcing him to cut green timber in lethal cold and burn it inefficiently with dangerous creosote accumulation. His children slept in the loft near the stove pipe, the only area that maintained tolerable warmth, while he and his wife kept watch by the fire, afraid to sleep lest it die and the cold claim them all. The Peterson family, newcomers who had arrived just before snow fell, were in genuine danger. Their iron stove was undersized for their cabin, and their wood supply was green cottonwood, not properly seasoned oak. By Monday afternoon, with temperatures holding at 28 below and the wind creating conditions that felt closer to 50 below, they made the difficult decision to abandon their homestead temporarily and shelter with the Lindstroms, bundling their 3 small children in every garment they owned and making the quarter-mile journey through snow and wind that threatened to steal their lives. Meanwhile, as winter approached its cruelest display, the Eriksen cabin told a different story. Lars had risen at his normal hour, 5:30 in the morning, and checked the interior temperature. The thermometer, hanging on the wall opposite the masonry heater, read 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, at 31 below, this represented a temperature difference of 88 degrees maintained with no attention to the fire since 10 o'clock the previous evening. Ingrid prepared breakfast at the table without shawl or extra layers, comfortable in her simple dress and apron. The children played on the floor, their favorite area being the space directly in front of the masonry heater where the radiant warmth made the wood planks themselves pleasant to sit upon. Lars prepared the morning fire, cleaning ash from the firebox, arranging kindling and 2 split oak logs, and lighting the fire with practiced efficiency. The fire burned hot and fast. Within 15 minutes, flames filled the small firebox, burning with the intense yellow-white color that indicated complete combustion at high temperature. The clay surface of the heater began to warm, though it never became dangerously hot to touch. After 90 minutes, the fire had consumed both logs completely, burning down to fine white ash with almost no coals remaining. Lars closed the firebox door and adjusted the small damper on the flue. The stove would now radiate its stored heat for the next 10 to 12 hours. By mid-morning, word had spread through the settlement that the Petersons had abandoned their cabin. Thomas McCarthy decided to make rounds, checking on the most vulnerable homesteads and delivering spare blankets and food where needed. His route took him past the Eriksen cabin, and he decided to stop, partly from concern and partly from curiosity about how Lars's experimental heating was faring under such extreme conditions. He knocked with numb knuckles, and Lars opened the door immediately. The wave of warm air that escaped into the frigid morning was shocking. Thomas stepped inside, and for a moment he simply stood in silence, his mind struggling to reconcile what his body was experiencing. The cabin was genuinely warm, not merely tolerable, but comfortable in a way his own home had not been in weeks. "What is your temperature inside?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse from breathing cold air all night. Lars checked the thermometer. 59 degrees, he reported. "It will drop maybe to 56 by evening when I make the second fire." 59. Thomas repeated the number as though it were a phrase in a foreign language. "Thomas, my cabin is 45 degrees right now, and I've been feeding the fire constantly since midnight. My hands are cracked and bleeding from handling frozen wood. My children are sleeping in their coats. And you're telling me you're at 59 degrees from 2 fires a day?" "The stove holds the heat," Lars said simply. "This is how it works." Thomas placed his hand against the clay surface of the masonry heater. It was warm, perhaps 150 degrees, he estimated, pleasant to touch for several seconds. He walked to the far corner of the one-room cabin, expecting to find the cold zone that existed in every home he knew. Instead, the temperature remained comfortable. The radiant heat from the massive clay structure reached every part of the room, warming not just the air but the walls, the floor, the furniture, the very bodies of the occupants. "How much wood have you used since this cold began?" Thomas asked. 2 logs at morning, 2 logs at evening," Lars replied. "Sometimes 3 in the evening if it's very cold. Today maybe I use 3 in the evening fire, just to be safe." The difference was undeniable. While neighboring cabins sat at a frigid 40 to 45 degrees despite burning wood constantly, Lars maintained 57 to 60 degrees, with 2 fires totaling perhaps 3 to 4 hours of actual burning time. The wood consumption was perhaps 1/10 of what conventional iron stoves required, and the comfort level was dramatically higher due to the even radiant heat. Over the next 3 days, as the cold snap continued with temperatures dropping to 34 below zero on Wednesday morning, the settlement witnessed the complete vindication of Lars Eriksen's so-called foolish heating experiment. His family remained comfortable and healthy while others suffered. His wood pile, which had seemed dangerously small in November, was proving more than adequate while others faced shortage. And the steady, gentle warmth of his masonry heater stood in stark contrast to the brutal temperature swings and cold zones that plagued every iron stove in the territory. Johan Lindström visited on Thursday. The first day temperatures rose above zero. He had come to borrow tools, but stayed to study the clay heater with the careful attention of a man whose worldview had been fundamentally challenged. "I was wrong," he said finally, his Swedish accent thick with emotion. "We were all wrong. This is better, much better. In the old country, everyone knows this," Lars replied without smugness. "Here, everyone forgot. Iron is new, iron is modern, so everyone thinks iron is better. But fire is old. Clay and stone are old. Some old things work better than new things. Word spread quickly after that. The settlement's informal gathering on Sunday became a technical seminar, with Lars explaining through translator help and demonstrations how the masonry heater worked. He described the internal channels, the importance of thermal mass, the hot fast burns versus the slow smoldering approach of iron stoves. Men who had mocked his tiny clay contraption 4 months earlier now took notes and asked detailed questions about construction techniques. The emotional shift from ridicule to respect was palpable and somewhat uncomfortable for some. Thomas McCarthy, to his credit, apologized publicly. "I thought you were foolish," he said to Lars at the Sunday gathering. "I thought you were risking your family with old country stubbornness. Instead, you were the wise one, and I was the fool. I'm sorry." Others echoed similar sentiments. Mary McCarthy mentioned to Ingrid that she had prepared extra quilts to offer the Eriksen family, assuming they would be suffering. "Instead," she said with a rueful laugh, "my family needed them while you were comfortable all along." By late January, as temperatures moderated to a merely brutal 10 below zero and daily highs approaching zero, 3 families had already committed to building masonry heaters for the following winter. Lars offered to help with construction, sharing his grandfather's knowledge freely. Johan Lindström spent an entire Saturday examining every detail of the heater, taking measurements, and sketching the internal channel design. He planned to build one in his own cabin before the next autumn, relegating his expensive iron stove to backup status. The Peterson family, who had returned to their cabin once the extreme cold passed, began saving money to purchase fire bricks and materials for a proper masonry heater. Their experience of near disaster had taught them that surviving the Dakota winter required more than just determination. It required wisdom, and sometimes that wisdom came from old knowledge carried across oceans by immigrants like Lars Eriksen. As winter continued through February and March, the Eriksen cabin remained a warm sanctuary while others shivered. Lars's wood pile, which would have seemed dangerously depleted in any other household, lasted easily through to April. He estimated he had burned perhaps 3 cords of wood for the entire winter, compared to the 15 to 20 cords his neighbors consumed. The time saved from constant fire tending allowed him to focus on other winter work, repairing tools, planning spring planting, carving furniture, and teaching his children Norwegian songs and stories in the comfort of their warm home. The difference was not merely one of comfort or fuel economy, though both were dramatic. It was a difference in quality of life during the harshest season. Families with iron stoves lived in a state of constant vigilance, always aware of the fire, always calculating wood supply, always dealing with extreme temperature swings and cold drafts. Lars's family, by contrast, lived normally, tending the fire twice daily as a simple routine, but otherwise freed from the tyranny of constant heating concerns. The stove had proven itself beyond any doubt. The tiny clay contraption that everyone had laughed at, that had seemed impossibly inadequate for Dakota winter, had outperformed every massive iron stove in the settlement. The science was sound, the construction was solid, and the results spoke louder than any argument or explanation ever could. The masonry heater that Lars Eriksen built in the autumn of 1867 continued to heat his family for the next 18 winters. The small cracks that had worried him in the first season stabilized after the initial thermal cycling, becoming part of the natural expansion and contraction pattern that the clay accommodated without structural failure. He performed minor maintenance annually, resealing joints and occasionally replacing fire bricks in the firebox, but the core structure remained sound and functional until the family eventually sold the homestead in 1885 to pursue new opportunities in the Montana Territory. By the winter of 1870, 7 families in the immediate settlement area had constructed their own masonry heaters, most with Lars's direct assistance. Each builder adapted the design to their specific needs and available materials. Thomas McCarthy built a larger version that incorporated a cooking surface, combining heating and food preparation in a single unit. Johan Lindström constructed an elegant heater using field stones from his property, creating a beautiful mosaic exterior while maintaining the essential internal channel design that made the system work. The knowledge spread beyond the immediate area as well. Frontier correspondence, the letters that settlers wrote to family back east or to friends in other territories, often mentioned the remarkable heating systems that Scandinavian and German immigrants were building. A letter from Mary McCarthy to her sister in Pennsylvania, preserved in historical archives, described Lars's clay stove as the most wonderful advancement in frontier living I have witnessed, more valuable than any modern convenience, for it has saved us from the misery of cold and the anxiety of wood shortage. Traveling merchants and circuit riders carried tales of the efficient heaters, and the knowledge filtered through immigrant communities where old country wisdom was still remembered. Finnish settlers in northern Minnesota built massive versions that heated two-story homes. German communities in Wisconsin constructed variations that combined heating with baking ovens. Russian immigrants in the Dakotas built corner heaters that became gathering places for entire families, incorporating sitting benches and sleeping platforms in the traditional style. The conventional wisdom of the American frontier, which had assumed iron stoves were the only serious option for heating, began to shift in regions with strong immigrant populations. By the 1880s, some builders were offering masonry heater construction as a professional service, having recognized both the performance benefits and the market demand from settlers tired of burning vast quantities of wood to achieve inadequate warmth. But the story also carries notes of loss and forgetting. As the frontier closed and rural electrification began in the early 20th century, followed by oil and gas heating systems, the knowledge of masonry heater construction faded once again. The children and grandchildren of pioneers like Lars Eriksen, seeking modern convenience and status, often removed the old clay heaters and replaced them with cast iron furnaces and eventually forced air systems. The thermal efficiency and comfort of radiant mass heating was forgotten in favor of the instant gratification of thermostatic control and fossil fuel abundance. By the mid-20th century, masonry heaters were virtually unknown in North America outside of isolated pockets where immigrant traditions remained strong. The oil crises of the 1970s sparked renewed interest in efficient heating, and a few builders and researchers began rediscovering the principles that Lars Eriksen and thousands of other immigrants had brought from Europe a century earlier. Modern masonry heaters, built with contemporary materials but following the same essential design, began appearing in high-efficiency homes, often marketed as cutting-edge technology despite being thousands of years old in concept. The irony is profound. A heating technology that was mocked as backwards and inadequate in 1867 proved superior to the industrial alternative. That same technology, forgotten and abandoned, is now being rediscovered as advanced and sustainable. The story of Lars Eriksen's clay stove is not unique, but rather representative of countless instances where traditional wisdom was dismissed in favor of modern approaches, only for the traditional wisdom to prove correct all along. Today, interest in masonry heaters is growing again, driven by concerns about energy efficiency, indoor air quality, and sustainable living. Modern builders construct sophisticated versions using refractory concrete, precision-engineered channels, and contemporary materials, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged from what Lars built with clay and river stones in a Dakota cabin. Thermal mass charged by intense, clean combustion and discharged slowly through radiation provides superior comfort with minimal fuel consumption. Historical societies in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas occasionally encounter surviving masonry heaters in old homestead cabins, recognizing them as artifacts of immigrant building traditions. A few have been carefully documented and preserved, teaching modern generations about the ingenuity and practical wisdom of frontier settlers who adapted Old World knowledge to New World challenges. The legacy extends beyond the specific technology to a broader lesson about innovation and tradition. True advancement is not always about adopting the newest methods or dismissing old ways as primitive. Sometimes it requires recognizing that solutions developed over centuries of practical experience contain wisdom that industrial products cannot match. Lars Eriksen understood this instinctively, trusting his grandfather's teaching over the confident assertions of neighbors who equated modern iron manufacturing with superiority. His story reminds us that survival on the frontier demanded both courage and humility. The courage to trust proven methods even in the face of ridicule, and the humility to learn from traditions carried by immigrants from distant lands. The settlers who mocked his tiny clay stove eventually became students of his grandfather's knowledge, and in doing so, they all became more comfortable, more efficient, and more successful in their homesteading endeavors. In an age where we often assume that newer is better, that technology always advances linearly towards superior solutions, the story of Lars Eriksen's Masonry Heater offers a different perspective. Sometimes the old ways work not because of nostalgia or tradition, but because they embody hard-won understanding of fundamental principles. Physics does not change with fashion. Heat transfer, thermal mass, and radiation worked the same in 1867 as they do today, and the pioneers who understood these principles, whether through scientific study or practical inheritance, built systems that remain impressive by any standard. The laughter that greeted Lars's construction in the autumn of 1867 had turned to respect by the winter and to widespread adoption within 3 years. But the greatest vindication came in the simplest of facts. While his neighbors burned 15 to 20 cords of wood each winter, constantly feeding their fires and still shivering in cold cabins, Lars Eriksen burned 3 cords, tended 2 fires daily, and lived in comfortable warmth with his family. His children grew up healthy and warm. His wife worked without constant cold and discomfort, and his wood pile lasted easily through even the harshest Dakota winters. The tiny clay stove that everyone laughed at proved to be not a gamble or an experiment, but a masterpiece of traditional technology, refined over centuries and perfectly suited to frontier conditions. And the single log that burned for 12 hours was not magic or exaggeration, but simply efficient physics applied with patient craftsmanship and old country wisdom. That wisdom, carried across an ocean by an immigrant who trusted his grandfather's teaching, changed how an entire frontier community understood the relationship between fire, heat, and survival. And in the quiet radiance of that clay heater, glowing warmly through long winter nights, lay a lesson about innovation, tradition, and the enduring power of knowledge passed down through generations.